Well, the right-wing Trump-supporting website, The Daily Caller, ran a happy headline for them saying that Donald Trump, as president, takes more questions than Joe Biden did as president. And they're right. They are very right to use the verb takes instead of the verb answers. Donald Trump takes more questions publicly than any president in history, but he answers fewer questions than any president in history because a lie is not an answer. To be a member of the White House press corps now is to become practiced in taking Donald Trump dictation of lies, which Donald Trump does with a casual confidence, knowing that the White House press corps will never scream at him the way they could scream at Joe Biden whenever they felt like it, whenever they had a chance, whenever they were close enough. And so when Donald Trump told his lies about firing 18 inspectors general late on Friday night, happened late on Friday night, he didn't tell his lies till later in the weekend, the White House press corps could do nothing but write down the lies and report them. Donald Trump, in effect, said that he had no personal knowledge of why he fired the inspectors general. He said, quote, "Some people thought that some were unfair or some were not doing the job." It's entirely possible that some people who Donald Trump talks to thought that some unnamed inspectors general were unfair. But who are those people who thought that? And what was the unfairness they imagined? There was no chance, zero chance, of getting any answers about that when Donald Trump told the White House press corps the lie that it was, quote, a very standard thing to do. They all reported that quote, and the good ones would say in the next line, as the New York Times did, that is not true. Richard Nixon was the most corrupt president in history prior to Donald Trump, and after Republican Richard Nixon's corruption forced him to resign from office in 1974, Congress spent the next few years coming up with ways to prevent the next Richard Nixon. One of those anti-Nixon, anti-corruption ideas was the creation of inspectors general in the government departments. Richard Nixon corrupted the Justice Department to the point that his Attorney General, John Mitchell, went to prison. And so to shore up the integrity of the Justice Department, there would now be an Inspector General of the Department of Justice and of every other department in the government. Richard Nixon abused the Internal Revenue Service by ordering tax audits of people on his enemies list. Congress then made that illegal and created an Inspector General in the Treasury Department to keep an eye on that. The Inspector General Act of 1978 passed the United States Senate unanimously, zero opposition. And one of the things that Republicans really loved about it was that inspectors general were charged with investigating waste, fraud, and abuse in every department of the government. Waste, fraud, and abuse was one of the Republican battle cries that Ronald Reagan was using then in what would become his successful campaign to be the next president of the United States. And Republican senators of that era were as outraged and offended by Republican President Richard Nixon's corruption as Democratic senators were. Outrage at presidential crime did not become partisan until the Trump era. After the corruption and impeachments and indictments of Donald Trump, Congress once again turned to the Inspector General law to try to add a defense against the next Donald Trump, who turned out to be Donald Trump. In 2022, Congress added specifics to the section referring to presidential removal of an inspector general, saying that a president needed to provide 30 days notice to Congress of the intention to remove an inspector general and provide, quote, substantive rationale, including detailed and case-specific reasons. Donald Trump didn't do either of those things when he did his late night, Friday night firings. And so Donald Trump could not finish his first week as President of the United States without violating the law.
Do you think he violated the law?
Well, technically, yeah, but he has the authority to do it.
Sorry, but it's really one of the other. It's either technically, yeah, or he has the authority to do it. It cannot be both. Senator Graham got it right the first time. Technically, yeah. Donald Trump violated the law. Republican Senator Susan Collins was willing to portray herself as the only adult in Maine without enough common sense to figure out what Donald Trump was actually doing. She said, "I don't understand why one would fire individuals whose mission is to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. So this leaves a gap in what I know is a priority for President Trump." One of the inspectors general, Hannibal Ware, said this.
Well, the reason is actually the most alarming part. The reason was due to changing priorities of the administration. And the reason that is alarming is because IGs are not a part of any administration. IGs oversee how the priorities of the administration is being conducted to make sure that there's transparency in government and to make sure that there's no fraud, waste, and abuse in how taxpayer funds are being expended. We're looking at what amounts to a threat to democracy, a threat to independent oversight, and a threat to transparency in government. This is the statute isn't just a technicality. It's a key protection of IG independence, is what it is. And just like you referenced, just over 2 years ago, these things were put in to strengthen our independence, not to weaken it and treat it as if it's a technicality.
The oldest member of the United States Senate, Republican Chuck Grassley of Iowa, used to consider himself, maybe still does consider himself, a champion of inspectors general. And his enthusiasm for inspectors general was so contagious that the junior senator from Iowa, Joni Ernst, joined him in helping to create a bipartisan team of senators whose plan, until this weekend anyway, was to strongly support inspectors general. Chuck Grassley is a Republican senator who I used to fully respect when I was the staff director of the Senate Finance Committee for the Democratic chairman, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and Senator Grassley was one of the Republican members of that committee. Chuck Grassley then was always a predictable vote because his positions were based on Republican Party principles of that time, including his very strong stance, along with all Republicans then, against tariffs in the committee that has jurisdiction over tariffs. Senator Grassley usually, but not always, voted against what Democrats were trying to do on the committee, and I never once questioned the motivation for his vote or the motivation of any of the Republican senators who voted against what the Democrats were trying to do. If anyone other than Donald Trump did a midnight mass firing of inspectors general, you would have seen that Chuck Grassley, who I knew and worked with, all over television, condemning that presidential action and immediately calling for an investigation in each committee of the Senate about the workings of those inspectors general. But 91-year-old Chuck Grassley has changed positions or silenced himself on so many issues, including tariffs in the Trump era, that it comes as no surprise that the most he was willing to come up with after something I know he deeply objects to was this statement. There may be good reason the IGs were fired. We need to know that, if so. I'd like further explanation from President Trump. Regardless, the 30-day detailed notice of removal that the law demands was not provided to Congress. Releasing that written statement meant that Chuck Grassley didn't have to handle the question Lindsey Graham had to handle. Was it illegal? I really miss the pre-Trump Chuck Grassley. There were times when I thought of Chuck Grassley as, in Senate terms at least, courageous in his consistency, and I personally disagreed with the policies he was so consistently supporting. Mark Greenblatt was the Inspector General of the Department of Interior until this weekend.
The key question here is who does the president appoint in the place of the IGs that he's removed? We are we're so-called watchdogs inside the federal agencies. So does he appoint true watchdogs or does he appoint lapdogs? If a member of the Trump administration is accused of ethics misconduct or some sort of criminal violation, will the IG be willing to investigate that in a fulsome and comprehensive manner? Will they be willing to come to findings, negative findings about that Trump political appointee? That is the key question.
And so this morning, thanks to Donald Trump, when Pete Hegseth reported to work at the Pentagon today for the first time as Secretary of Defense, he had the pleasure of knowing, as he entered the building, that he wouldn't have to go through the metal detector, and there was no Inspector General left in the Pentagon. No one in the Pentagon empowered to investigate Pete Hegseth.
The American people, if we don't have good and independent inspector generals, are going to see the swamp refill. They're going to see rampant waste, fraud. They're going to see corruption. It may be the president's goal here, when he's got a meme coin that's making him billions, is to remove anyone that's going to call the public attention to his malfeasance.